Okay, so my name is Zineb Sedira, and I'll be showing here Dundee Contemporary Art, Can't You See the Sea Changing, which is a title that I've given to the first iteration of the show because it started at the De la War Pavilion in Bexhill-on-Sea. And now we are showing it for the second time here in Scotland, which I'm very excited about. Because it's an exhibition already which is looking at the sea in my practice. And I'm always interested in recontextualizing that space of the sea, whether it's in Scotland, in England, in North Africa, or in the south of France, or any other countries for that matter. The sea is always changing, really. I mean, I'm talking about geopolitics now. I'm talking about that political space that perhaps a space like the sea or the desert, for that matter, can bring. It's a contested space also because it's a space that can be seen as an open space, a space of freedom, if we want, for people who can travel on that sea quite easily. But for other people, if you think of the other side of the Mediterranean or the Atlantic, looking at Africa, perhaps, or the Middle East, the sea becomes a barrier. It becomes a space that stops you really moving. But also it's a barrier of a lot of history, whether it's slavery, whether it's piracy. You know, there is a lot of kind of stories and histories around the sea, not always connected to immigration, but to many, you know, I'm thinking also of the sale and the travel of goods, notably in one of the pieces here in the show called Transmettre en Abîme, where we're looking at the way sugar's been brought from one country to the other. So I think it's a very rich space, really. I mean, I've always been known as an artist who used the autobiographical in my work. I've done from a long time ago work already, including my mother, my father, my daughter, and carried on. And the reason for that is because I was looking at the story of immigration from my parents from North Africa, from actually Algeria to France, you know, in the early 60s. And my parents were always quite a nice starting point for the work I wanted to do, or the themes in the work. But then I immigrated myself from France to the UK by boat, because at the time in the mid-80s, there was no Eurostar, so you had to do that journey to the UK by boat, and you could really feel this idea of the island that you don't feel anymore now, because you've got that kind of tunnel that links the two countries. So the immigration of my parents, my own immigration to the UK, became a very important leitmotif or subject matter for me, around also this idea of post-colonial, you know, discussion or discourses. And the work is becoming more personal now, because not only I put myself in the frame physically, not so much my parents and my children anymore, but myself, but now I'm bringing also my own collections. I'm a collector. I'm somebody who collects a lot of objects, particularly from the period of the 50s, 60s. And this is explained also because perhaps I was born in the 60s, and because I think the 60s were a very interesting political decade, where a lot of kind of movements, political movements were created, whether it's the anti-colonial, the anti-war. There was a lot of feminist movement, anti-nuclear movement, etc. were created. There was a lot of things happening in culture, whether it's in cinema, in art, and in music, around this film of anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism. So for me, this decade of the 60s is very significant to this politics that interests me. When I was with the curator, Joseph from the De la War Pavilion, and we were in my studio talking about the project, and suddenly we looked in the studio, and I realized that even in my studio, I had collected and put in my studio a lot of ephemeras from the sea. Some were from the 60s and some were more recent. But the books that I was reading around the sea, the photograph I was collecting, the postcard, the objects, and then we decided to bring my studio into the exhibition. But I thought it would be interesting for people to see and have an insight of my thinking processes and and the way I create work, really, within all the subjects that I collect. So in the exhibition here, we've got another piece of work which is actually recent, called Sea Rocks. It's those big photographs of rocks taken by the sea in Algeria, so in North Africa. The rocks were very much eaten by the erosion of the sea, and time passing by had created some kind of very interesting marking onto those rocks. And I thought that would be interesting to talk about that also, the sea eating up the land somehow, because this is really what's happening, and we can see it here in some borders of the UK, where, you know, land is being literally eaten up and houses are falling into the sea, because the sea somehow is moving, and, you know, when I say, can't you see the sea changing, it's part of that. It's not fixed, you know, it moves. It's growing up somehow also. It's getting dirtier, you know, it's getting more, it's perhaps more like a killing machine also now, because you have all those people, you know, trying to escape by boat and dying at sea. We have so many stories of that today. This sea that is supposed to be blue is perhaps becoming closer to the red color now. You know, that's often what I think about this story of immigration. It's important to say also that I don't do digital photography. I took analog photography, film. So for me, the physicality of the negative is very important. I scan them, put them in my hard drive for easiness of use, but really I always print from the negative. So we decided to print them quite life-size and to kind of replace this idea of staging, because if you go behind the photograph, the sea rocks, you have a wooden panel with legs, a bit like theater set design or film set design, and I'm very much at the moment into film or theater set design. So I thought it'd be interesting to recreate this idea with the sea rocks and place them within the space, and people can move around. Instead of having photograph on the wall, you can actually move around and see and I'm always also interested in what happens behind the scene. So here you have that, what's happening behind that photograph. So the photograph somehow becomes three-dimensional and opens up to a lot of other questioning, which is not just about the image itself. Okay, so there is a video installation called Lighthouse in the Sea of Time, which comprises of 3 different elements, 3 projection and 2 plasma screens. And because there is a lighthouse in Folkestone, I thought it would be quite nice to do something around the lighthouses in Algeria. After a lot of research, I realized that those lighthouses do have lighthouse keepers. I decided to concentrate on one in the city, in the capital, Algiers, and the second one more in a rural, you know, in the countryside, in a region called Kabylia. As I was working there, I spent time. I was lucky to spend a few nights in each of those lighthouses, and spent a lot of time with the lighthouse keeper. And hear its stories. So he will tell us stories about things he's seen or done. So I got really interested in really interviewing him to talk about his job as a lighthouse keeper. The main story that always, and I'm known for also, I think as an artist, is this idea of transmission or sharing of knowledge and transmitting ideas, stories that might disappear if not brought back to light. So I'm always trying to find a little story or a place or a person or a job. Here it's a lighthouse keeper job, for example, where I feel that if I don't tell the story, this story will disappear or will be neglected. So by bringing it to the forefront and using it in my practice, I'm giving it some light. I'm actually saying, please pause 2 seconds, listen to that lighthouse keeper, because we don't have this job anymore in Europe. All the lighthouses have been automated today or computerized. So to find still that there are lighthouse keepers who do this amazing job and who love doing it, you know, with so much passion, was for me amazing. I had to tell the story of that lighthouse keeper. You know, I had to tell, his story. And if you spend time listening to it, you think you find that it's a fascinating kind of job and opportunity. You know, my work is still political, but it's also poetical, and that's always kind of balance I'm trying to keep in the work, because I do think it's easier to share messages, because the work is also about a message you're trying to convey or to share with someone. It's easier to do it via metaphors rather than by, you know, facts and asserting some facts or some realities that belongs to you, really. Metaphor, so it's a bit like a dream. It kind of allows you to move in and out and decide for yourself what you want to take from the work, perhaps.